Ray Dalio released his unconventional model on how the economy works in 2013 that is still relevant today. The 30-minute video is titled How the Economic Machine Works. It's an excellent summary of all the complex factors responsible for an economy's ups and downs. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Finance Guardian channel. Today, I'm going to give you the major points that Ray Dalio shared in his 30-minute video. You'll be glad you spent the time to understand how the economy works because it will not only help you become a better investor, but you'll also know how to position yourself for success. Whether things go well or badly in the economy, hit that subscribe button and the bell beside it and let's get started. The economic machine is simple, yet few people understand it, and this ultimately causes economic suffering. In spite of its apparent complexity, the economy relies on simple transactions that are driven by human nature and repeated zillions of times. The economy is driven by three forces. Number 1, productivity growth. Number 2, short-term debt cycle. And number 3, the long-term debt cycle. These will come later, but first, let's talk about transactions. The fundamental nature of transactions is to exchange money or credit between buyers and sellers for goods, services, or financial assets. Everyone from individuals to businesses to governments all operate this way. The price is simply determined by the amount spent over the number of units sold. It is the transactions that form the economic machine. Understanding transactions gives you a clear picture of how the whole economy works. A country's economy is nothing more than the sum of all its transactions. Money and credit drive economic activity as they comprise the bulk of expenditures in an economy. The market, the government, and the central bank. The market is represented by all buyers and sellers making transactions. There are wheat markets, stock markets, steel markets, oil markets, and so on. All of these sub-markets combine to form the entire market or the economy as a whole. There is no greater buyer or seller than the government. However, it is critical to distinguish the central government from the central bank. Central banks, including the Federal Reserve in the United States, influence interest rates and print money in order to control the amount of money and credit in the economy. When it comes to credit flows, the central bank plays a fundamental role. Credit. Credit plays the most decisive role in the economy as it is both the biggest and most volatile component. Borrowers and lenders. Lenders lend money in order to make more of it. Borrowers borrow money to buy things they cannot afford, such as a house, a car, a business, or stocks. Borrowers are required to repay the amount borrowed, the principal, with interest. Borrowing is low when interest rates are high. Borrowing is high when interest rates are low. Credit is created when lenders believe borrowers will repay. Credit can be created from nothing. In fact, of the $53 trillion in the economy at the time the video was released, $50 trillion was credit, not actual money. Whenever credit is issued, it becomes a debt. For the borrower, it is a liability, and for the lender, it is an asset. Once the transaction is settled, it disappears. The availability of credit allows borrowers to increase their spending. This is fundamental because one person's spending is another's income. Because the other person has a higher income and lenders believe that they will repay the principal with interest, they can now borrow more money to boost their own spending. Eventually, this raises someone else's earnings, creating a cycle. Productivity growth. Learning, knowledge acquisition, and working all contribute to productivity growth over time. Credit matters in the short run, but productivity matters in the long run. Productivity growth isn't a big driver of economic swings since it doesn't fluctuate much, but debt certainly is. When we acquire debt, we consume more than we produce, and when we have to pay it back, we consume less. Debt swings occur in two cycles, a short-term cycle of 5 to 8 years and a long-term cycle of 75 to 100 years. In reality, most people don't even see it because they live day by day and week by week. It's like when you don't notice that you're growing older until an insensitive friend from high school spots you and says, "Man, you've aged." I'm not referring to myself here. Getting back to the economic machine. Boosting an economy that lacks credit can be done only by working harder and smarter. This involves more productivity, which is slower and linear in nature. Debt cycles. Whenever you borrow, you are creating a cycle. If you borrow, you are effectively borrowing from your future self. A future self who will need to spend less than they make. This holds true for the individual as well as for the economy as a whole. This creates a mechanical, predictable sequence of events as Dalio describes it. Credit isn't always a bad thing. It's only bad when it finances overconsumption that cannot be repaid, as in the case of Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain during the 2010s. If it efficiently allocates resources that produce income in order to repay debt, then that's good. For example, when a consumer purchases a television with credit, that is considered bad debt. In contrast, the purchase of a tractor to harvest fields, generate income, repay debt, and have a better quality of life is good debt. If something goes up, it must eventually come down, and cycles are no exception. Short-term debt cycle. Expansion marks the beginning of the cycle. Increased spending increases incomes and asset values, which leads to inflation. Inflation also occurs when spending is faster than the production of goods, which means there is more demand than supply. To control inflation, the central bank raises interest rates, making credit more expensive while decreasing borrowing, spending, and incomes. This results in deflation when prices drop again. Economic activity declines, which may lead to a recession if unabated. During this time, central banks lower interest rates in order to stimulate borrowing and spending, expedite economic activity, and bring the economy out of a recession. Economic expansion occurs when credit is available. When it isn't, it leads to recession. The short-term debt cycle lasts for about 5 to 8 years and occurs again and again over the next decades. As the cycle progresses, the peak and trough of the cycle become higher and higher, which means more debt and more growth is accumulated. This leads us to long-term debt cycle. Generally speaking, long-term debt cycles last 75 to 100 years. Lenders continue to lend money despite the fact that more debt is accumulated through short-term debt cycles. This is due to the present-oriented view of the world, high incomes, booming stock markets, and so on. However, as COVID-19 and previous crashes demonstrate, the recent past isn't always a reliable indicator of the future. Economic bubbles are prevented by such irrational exuberance. The debt burden. When incomes grow relative to debts, a balance is preserved. Nevertheless, debt burdens arise when debt growth exceeds income growth. The debt burden is determined by the debt-to-income ratio. People may feel wealthy as the value of their assets soars, but a wise philosopher once said that we should not confuse the trappings of success with success itself. Borrowers may still feel creditworthy and be able to borrow and spend, but that's because they have collateral backing up their borrowings. As the debt burden increases, the value of this collateral can be lost. A growing debt burden creates a larger debt repayments over decades, and eventually it reaches a peak, as was the case with the global financial crisis in 2008, Japan in 1989, or during the Great Depression in 1929. During this period, consumption declines, borrowing stagnates, incomes drop, asset values plummet, stocks fall, and social tensions rise. This is what's known as deleveraging. In some ways, it is a little similar to what we're seeing now, although the COVID-19 crisis wasn't brought on by long-term debt cycles correcting themselves, but a force majeure external event and government intervention. In an instant, the collateral used to securitize loans has lost all of its value, and banks find themselves in trouble. It led to the massive bailout of banks like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, State Street, and others as part of a massive US $700 billion bailout bill in 2008. Lehman Brothers weren't so lucky. Because interest rates are already at zero at this point in the long-term debt cycle, we can no longer use them to stimulate the economy. Deleveraging differs from a recession in that the debt burden is too great and cannot be alleviated by lowering interest rates. So, how should we proceed now? 4 ways to deleverage the economy. The economy can be brought back to its feet through 4 levers during a deleveraging. Number 1, cut spending. Number 2, reduce debt. Number 3, redistribute wealth from the haves to the have-nots. And number 4, print more money. 3 rules of thumb for life. Dalio concludes by giving us 3 rules of thumb with which we can navigate the economy ourselves, whether it be in our own businesses, the organizations we work for, or in our own personal finances. Number 1, don't let your debt pile up faster than your income, because debt will eventually overwhelm you. Number 2, don't let your income rise faster than your productivity, otherwise you'll lose your competitive edge. And number 3, do everything you can to boost productivity. In the end, that's what matters most. And that is all the time that we have today, folks. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please remember to hit that like button. If you're new around here, subscribe to our channel, and on your way out, please do remember to click on that bell icon too so you can remain updated about all of our future videos. You're welcome to the channel where you will learn the basics of personal finance in easy to understand language. We'll see you next time.